All right, so got that pack back assignment due next week. I would kind of highly encourage getting that started early, well in advance of that due date. Easy points. Make sure you're getting registered well in advance. Everything's working smoothly. Other than that, what'll pop up after today's class? Module 3 quiz and the module 4. Those are both due end of the day Monday. Okay. So same kind of thing. We're going to keep going week by week. Just kind of give us a roadmap. There's not really a lot of housekeeping stuff for me to get out of the way here today. CL sessions, just like they were, started last week, Thursday, Sundays. Right, those times and available locations are up on Canvas. I talked about that Tuesday. One of the leaders can't make it this Sunday, so I put up an announcement. I forget which room it is, 243 on Sunday. Well, there's still multiple locations in every time slot, so even if you go to Ballantine, there's multiple sessions there if you want to attend. I also, excuse me, reiterated, I know I mentioned this date, week 1 or day 1. There's additional tutoring sessions where it's basically graduate students who are over in Wiley Hall on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursdays from 6 to 9 p.m. They don't have my materials or anything like kind of planned out, but if you have questions, you bring questions, then they'll help you work through those, right? So it's kind of like private, it's kind of like one-on-one tutoring, or there might be other people there that are asking questions. Maybe you can just, see what they're asking, kind of see them work through that. So just making you available or making you known, making you aware of these different opportunities that exist, or making you, sure you know that they exist. You don't have to make an appointment or anything. It's just kind of show up, first come, first serve. Other than that, I don't think there's anything else that I have to kind of mention. If there's any other questions unrelated to material before we kind of jump back into things here today. Okay, so go a little bit quick through this first part because it's pretty similar to what we did on Tuesday's class. I want to make sure we have time for what I think is a little more difficult stuff. So I've got a summary of demand shifters here. So one thing for this week, if you're like having the slides, sometimes I put more in there, my vicious. We're not going to talk about taxes on consumers, so don't worry about that at all. I'll work through later a couple examples where we think about subsidies to consumers and how that's going to shift demand. So that is fair game, and I'll work through some examples where I use that today. But ultimately, the things that shift or increase demand or decrease demand, they're all going to shift the same way. We said increases in demand look like what? Rightward shifts, and we'll see why that matters when we talk about supply here in a second. Decreases in demand look like leftward shifts. This is kind of a summary of those things. I said if you want to, scratch off the higher taxes on consumers. We're not going to worry about taxes on consumers yet, okay? What we are going to start today with then is not demand, but supply, okay? So we said with demand, as the price goes up, and this is easy for us to think about demand because most of us buy things. We're consumers, right? So when the price was higher, what happened to the amount that you wanted to buy? It went down. There's an inverse relationship. If I'm selling something and the price goes up, is that a good or a bad thing? If I'm selling something, is that a good thing as the seller? Yes, right? Whatever I sell it for, that's how much money I'm making, right? So here, supply works in the exact opposite direction. When I have higher prices, people or producers or sellers want to supply more, or the quantity supplied increases. Okay. So just like with demand, we can have a supply schedule that tells us at these various prices, how much is this producer or supplier willing to supply? Well, as that price goes up, they should be willing to supply more. So notice here, as the price is increasing, the quantity supplied from this firm is going to go up. Okay. I'll talk a little bit more about the intuition behind this in a second. But just like with demand, if I have a demand schedule, I said, how could I visually come up with my demand curve? I just took each one of these points and I started plotting them, right? At a price of 0, I'm not going to supply anything to the market. If the price goes up to $1, maybe I'll supply those first 3 units. $2, I'll supply the first 6 units. So on and so forth. I plot all of these points, and my supply schedule is essentially giving me this supply curve, right? The supply curve is just the visual representation of my supply schedule. Just like demand, the demand curve was our visual representation of the demand schedule. Same sort of thing, right? Not reinventing the wheel here, okay? Any questions on this idea? Like I said, I'm going to go through it kind of quick because we went through a lot of this. It took more time on Tuesday's class. So I also have a supply equation, just like I have my demand equation. It looks, when I just write it out here, it's the exact same thing as I had for demand. There's going to be one small difference. So what's the intercept? In this example for you, what would the intercept of my supply equation be? Where does it hit the y-axis? It's an easy one. 0, right? That won't always be the case, but we're going to have some intercept value for A. Now the slope, notice what's true about the slope for the supply equation. It's always going to be, as someone say it, positive. What was the slope of the demand equation? Negative, right? The slope captures the relationship between the price and quantity demanded, or here the price and the quantity supplied. So I know that I'm always going to end up with, and actually here, I copy and pasted. So let's make sure that's right. Or no, sorry, we're doing supply today. That was right, right? So here, how could I come up with a slope for my previous example? Well, here I'm telling you it's 1/3. Well, how do I find the slope of any line? It's the change in y over the change in x. What's my y-axis? Price. So between each one of these points, how much is price changing by? $1. What's my x-axis? Quantity supplied. How much is the quantity supplied changing between every single point? So 1/3, right? So that would be the value of B, or my slope in this example. So do everything the exact same. It's just the slope is going to be positive for our supply. Nothing too crazy here. Now, if I'm thinking about my supply curve, and my supply equation from this example, let's think about it. It's kind of thought experiment here. So for this very first unit, right, I'm not going to use this equation. I'm just going to try to give you a little more of context behind what's happening with the supply curve. So if this is the very first price, let's say the first price that I was willing to supply the very first unit to the market as the seller was at $4. So that means that if the price was $3, I was not willing to supply that first unit yet, right? So what inherently must that mean? If I choose to do something, that means that my marginal benefit is what relative to my marginal cost? If I choose to do something, my marginal benefit must be greater than or equal to, okay? So what's the marginal benefit, right, to the seller of a good? When I sell something, the benefit to me is how much I can sell it for, or the price, right? So we know that if the very first price at which I'm willing to supply that first unit is $4, that means the very first price where this is greater than or equal to my marginal cost will be when the marginal cost is equal to $4. So essentially, our supply equation or our supply curve is telling us that for this first unit, if the very first price that I'm willing to supply to the market is at $4, that must mean that is my marginal cost of that first unit. Now, if the price goes any higher, for sure, now I'm more than willing to supply that first unit. But the very first price at which I'm willing to supply it, that must be the price that's exactly equal to my marginal cost. So just like with demand, we said demand represented the what to consumers? Marginal. Talk about two marginal things. So consumers, demand represented the marginal benefit, to producers, our supply equation represents our marginal cost to the producers, right? So this is where it gets a little bit confusing because now the marginal benefit to producers is simply the price they're selling it for. The marginal cost is reflected by the supply curve, okay? So my supply equation, this price essentially represents the marginal cost of these different quantities. So if I want to find the marginal cost of the very first unit, what would I do? Just plug a 1 in here, right? What if I wanted to find the marginal cost of the second unit? Just plug a 2 in, right? So I think in the slides, I said, what's the marginal cost of a quantity of 2? Well, here that would be what? 2/3. What's the marginal cost if the quantity was 6? Plug a 6 in here. I'd get what? Exactly 2, so on and so forth. Right? So the demand curve told us our marginal benefits to consumers. The supply curve will tell us, or the supply equation tells us, the marginal costs to producers. Any questions over anything there? So this is where it gets hard from here on out when we talk about supply today. You have to like switch your mindset. Most of us, we buy things, the price is a bad thing. If I'm selling something, price is a good thing, right? All right. I think that's all I want to say. Any other questions on this before we keep moving here? Okay. So I didn't hit this last bullet point yet, but we said we plug in these different quantities to figure out what our marginal cost was. I think I did 2 and 6 instead of 2, 3, and 9, but you can do whatever quantity you're interested in. So if the supply curve represents marginal costs, what's happening to my marginal cost as I produce more and more? They're going up. That should sound very similar. What did we talk about last week? On my production possibilities curve, if I'm producing more and more of a product, what's happening to the slope? Getting steeper, or my marginal costs were increasing. As companies produce more and more of a product, what's happening to the marginal cost? It is increasing essentially, right? If they were thinking about like a company-wide production possibilities curve, their marginal costs are increasing. Yeah. Any other questions on this? So with consumers, the marginal benefit was increasing. For producers, the marginal costs are increasing. Okay. So I'll kind of combine this idea with thinking about the first thing we talked about last class, things that shift demand. Right? We're also going to have things that shift supply. But up to this point, what I was showing you was really like one firm supply curve. How do I get, instead of an individual firm supply curve, market supply? Well, with consumers, or with demand, how did I come up with market demand? I just took everybody's individual demand and I added it up. Guess how I find market supply? I take every individual supply curve and add it up at every single price, right? So if I had 2 firms, right, and the various prices, here's how much they're willing to supply the market. First of all, what would, if I'm thinking about who has a steeper supply curve here? So what would the slope of Starbucks be? We already did this one. It was 1/3. What's the slope Jitterbugs? Looks like change in Y or price is 1, change in X is now 2. So 1/2. So their supply curve is going to be a little bit steeper. How do I come up with market supply at every single price? So let's say the price is 3. What is market supply? Well, if this firm is supplying 9 units, this one's supplying 6, the total market supply would be 15, right? Just adding those up. So it's the same kind of thing we were doing with demand. To get market supply, you just add up each individual supply curve. Okay. Now, once I have market supply, I've got these different prices, the different markets, there's different quantity supplied to market. I can just graph that out. This is my market supply curve. Now, it looks no different, really, than my individual supply curve, other than the fact that it's higher quantities, right? Because it's now not representing the quantity supplied of one firm, but of every firm in that industry. like I said, I'm going quick, so stop me if you have questions. I think this is a little bit easier. I want to save time for some stuff I think it's a little bit trickier as we get later in the class. Okay. So I'm going to skip ahead in the slides a little bit because I think it makes sense. So let's say I've got my market supply curve. So I've got kind of the market quantity supplied, and it looks something like this. Okay. If I have a third person, so I had my earlier example, we had two firms. Let's say a third firm enters this market. What's going to happen at every single price? My market supply will now be what? If I have three instead of two firms, how do I find market supply? I add them all up. So if I add a third firm, my new market supply has to be higher, right? I don't think that's, I mean, I guess technically if that third firm produces zero at every price, we're assuming they supply something, right? So as I have more individual supply curves to add in, what's going to happen to my market supply? At every price, my market supply is going to increase, right? I just have more people selling this good, right? So this supply curve will be higher, which looks like a what? Rightward shift. So this is why I said don't use up and down. I don't like to use that term because it can get confusing, especially when we talk about supply. It wasn't as much for demand. You might have been like, oh, we're full of shit. Why it looks fine if I go up and down my arrows. But notice here, this tells us when I have more firms, I'm adding in more. My quantity supply to every price is higher. This is a supply increase. We can all agree on that. What does this look like, though, if I draw up and down arrows? Looks like a down arrow. Well, this is not a supply decrease, right? It just visually, the line looks lower. That doesn't tell us that supply is up or down, increase or decrease, which is why I don't like to use up or down. I like to use supply is increased or decreased, which are rightward and leftward shifts. Okay. Any questions? So this was representing an increase in the number of sellers or producers or all these three words. I'll go back and forth between all three of them. They all mean the same thing. Producers, sellers, suppliers. Right? There's different ways of referencing that someone's selling the product. Pretty with me on that one? Should be one of the easier supply shifts, I think. Okay. Okay with that? So what would a supply decrease look like? Well, that would mean, so let's say all of a sudden, I don't know, there was a bunch of people producing like PPE stuff during COVID, like masks, all this stuff. Now there's many firms have left that industry. There's not as many suppliers. What would happen to supply? Supply has decreased, which means that no matter what the price of these products was, there are now fewer people selling them. So a supply decrease is going to look like a leftward shift, right? And then I guess here, let me be a little more clear. That was our increase, okay? So rightward shifts, doesn't matter if it's supply or demand, increases. Leftward shifts, doesn't matter if it's supply or demand, decreases, okay? Everybody with me on that one? Shouldn't be too bad here, okay? So I jumped around a little bit. I already kind of talked about this. This is where like I would just cross out the upward, downward. I guess if for some reason it makes sense to you, you can use it. I just think it's more confusing to think of it that way. I would kind of rely on this right and left. Okay. I'll show another way of thinking about this. So let's say I did have a supply. What would this be? Well, I labeled it here, but it's a decrease, a leftward shift. Even if I don't draw my arrows, like I draw them up or whatever, think about decreases in supply is if my line is moving closer to that 0 point, right? So supply is decreasing, it's moving towards 0. So when I'm drawing this kind of leftward shift that's pushing me towards 0, that's a decrease. If I have a supply increase, that's pushing me away from that 0 point, which is why supply increases look like kind of like rightward shifts, right? It's pushing me further out away from that origin or that 0 point. It's another way of thinking about it. Okay. Any questions on? So I think I skipped through all this stuff and went right to the number of sellers, right? So we've kind of already analyzed that one. We're going to now talk about instead something else that will shift supply. And I'll show it to you in a slightly different way of thinking about shifts in supply. Might be, I always hesitate because it might be confusing for some, but it also might help the understanding of other people. So I always like to present things in as many ways as possible given our time. So input prices, right? So if I'm thinking about, let's say I have higher input prices, I have here, that's going to decrease supply. So let's think about why. Let's say I'm producing these batteries for like electric, I don't know, today I'm going to use electric vehicles a lot. I don't know why, it's on my mind. Electric vehicles, like the batteries that they use, they need lithium, right? So let's say all of a sudden lithium, I don't know why, there's a supply chain issue and it becomes way, a lot more expensive. Well, essentially, if something that I require to make a good, I need lithium to make these batteries. If it now, the price of lithium goes up, what's happening to my cost to produce these batteries? Going up. So if my costs are higher, am I going to want to supply more or less of that good? Less. My supply is going to decrease. Right? You kind of think about this as, other examples are if I'm, I don't know. Let's say I'm making I saw you had eggs and some breakfast sandwich or something like that. The price of eggs, because of bird flu and all these other things, is skyrocketing. To produce a breakfast sandwich, one of the inputs is going to be eggs. So if the price of eggs is going up, what's going to happen to the supply of breakfast sandwiches? No, right? My input prices go up. Computers are a pretty good example. I don't know all of the different raw materials that go into making microchips, but a lot of those metals and things have become cheaper and cheaper over time, which is why laptops have become like universal, because as the input prices have fallen, what happens to supply of that good? Well, if it's cheaper to make it, I'm going to want to supply more of it to the market, right? So it works the opposite way as well. If my input prices go down, supply is going to increase for that product. Okay. So I've got some other examples, just a dumb one, but like if sugar prices go up, the supply of candy is going to go down, right? If I'm making these like orange mocha frappuccinos, if the cost of milk goes up to make these, drinks that require milk, I'm going to supply less of those as well, right? If then my input prices, actually here milk price went down. So now it's cheaper to make these products and actually supply more of them. Another one that's really interesting to think about, because almost every good, this is like baked into it. For, I don't know, fast food, anything where you've got minimum wage workers. If the government all of a sudden decides to increase the minimum wage, what has that done to your input prices? If I'm McDonald's and the minimum wage goes up, what's happened to the cost to producing anything at McDonald's? Gone up. So minimum wage increases essentially are increasing input prices for a lot of these companies that have minimum wage jobs. If their input prices go up because of this minimum wage, what happens to their supply? There's less supply to the market. All right. So we can kind of think about how input prices are going to impact supply here. Okay. Now, another one that we'll talk about. So here, I don't know. I've got it drawn here. If the price of my inputs go down, I'm going to increase supply. Got another way of thinking about this that I think might line up with some people. All right. So let's do a supply curve. And I said that the supply curve represented what? The marginal cost to producers. Okay. So if my input prices go down, If I continue to produce instead, I'm thinking about the same quantity. If it costs me less to make, what's happened to my marginal cost if I produce the same amount? So let's say I'm building new homes. I got the same amount of lumber, but all of a sudden lumber becomes cheaper. To build the same number of homes, my marginal cost has, if I'm building new homes that require lumber, price of lumber goes down. If I keep building the same number of homes, my costs have decreased, all right? It's cheaper. The raw materials are cheaper. I can build the same number of homes and the wood costs me less money, right? So if I have input prices that go down to produce the same amount, my costs are now lower. And that's true no matter how many, in my example, new homes I'm building, the costs are going to be lower at every single number, which is why if input prices go down, what's happening to my supply curve? It's a rightward shift. My supply is going up, right? Or it's increasing. I shouldn't say up, right? I should say increasing. But just another way of thinking about it, it's kind of on the different axis, right? So we can think about it at the same price, I'd be willing to supply more when it costs me less to make this good. But because the supply curve represents marginal costs, when input prices go down at every quantity, essentially my marginal costs are now lower. And that's just another way of understanding kind of why that supply curve is shifting the way that it is. Any questions on this? So another thing that I have as a separate slide, but it's really all going to be baked into the same thing. What is something that is going to change my input prices, right? In fact, I'll even give you kind of a sneak peek. So remember when we last week, we're talking about production possibilities curves. If I had a new technology advancement, and let's say it impacted X, that meant that if I was using all my resources, I could now produce more of X. But let's say it didn't impact Y. So what was happening to my slope? It's becoming flatter, or my marginal costs were going down, right? So what's something that's going to drive input prices lower? Technology advancements, right? Or technology advancements, right? So let's say my electric vehicle example, let's say all of a sudden there's some new breakthrough and they can find a way that using the same amount of lithium, where we were only getting 10 batteries before, we can now get 20. Well, essentially, I'm using the same amount of lithium, I'm getting twice as many batteries. So what's happened to my cost per battery? It went down, right? So technology advancements are really the same thing as lowering input prices, right? I mean, I guess technically you could have like a technology development, like where you go back closer to the Stone Age, but in practice, we haven't really seen that happen in modern times, right? But maybe there's like a law that makes something illegal so that the technology actually reverts. You would have that if you had like a technology decrease, you could actually increase input prices. For the most part, we're only going to talk about technology advances because that's really what we see in practice. Okay. Does that make sense? Any questions on this? Okay. So we have this relationship of input prices to supply. I just talked about technology that also increases supply. So we love technology, right? We'll be increasing our supply curve. We'll ultimately see later on what happens to equilibrium prices, or what happens to the prices that we have to pay because of that. But for now, we just know how it's going to shift that supply curve. Okay? We talked about the number of sellers. The next thing we're going to talk about, I'm going to kind of punt or skip market expectations, because every individual good is going to have slightly different market expectations. So I chose like a colder winter here as an example. I'll come back to this in a second, but any market expectation we can automatically link up to impacting price expectations. So we said with consumers, if they expect the price to be higher or lower tomorrow, that can shift the current demand. Same kind of thing is going to happen with prices. So I'll walk through kind of a shorthand of this, and then we'll go back to the slides, but I think this might help kind of piece it together. So let's say I expect future prices of something to be higher. Okay. If I'm the seller of this good, what's going to happen to my current supply? So let's think about the example I said with market expectations. If I'm a company, a natural gas company, and I think it's going to be a really cold winter, what do I think people are going to be willing to do in the winter then when they buy natural gas? Pay a higher price, right? So if I think that prices are going to be really high this winter for my product, natural gas, what might I do today? Stockpile it, not sell it today, so that I can sell it when the price is higher. Because for me, that's a good thing. I'm the seller of this good. So when I think the price is going to be higher in the future, as a seller, what do I do today? Supply less of it to the market, right? If I think that prices are going to be lower in the future, right? What's going to happen to my current supply? Well, if I think, let's say, I'll use this example because you're all in the business school, so hopefully you should start to think about it this way. It's a bit of a unique product, but it's still a product. Any type of like stock, right? Mutual fund. If I think all of a sudden the stock market's going to plummet, and it is, what might I really want to do today? Sell. So if I think that in the future prices are going to be lower because I think the stock is going to plummet, what happens to my current supply? I want to sell today. So find an example that makes sense. Yeah, the stock market one I think is somewhat helpful. Really anything, if I'm selling it, I want to sell it when the price is high. If that's not today, right? If I think the prices are going to be higher tomorrow, I'm not going to sell it today. I'm going to try to hold out. If the price is higher today, it's going to be lower in the future, then I'm going to try to sell it higher. I'm going to be more likely to try to sell it today. So this works a little bit different, almost the exact opposite of when we talk about price expectations with consumers, because for consumers, price is a bad thing. For the producers, price is a good thing. And then it's the same rightward, leftward shifts, right? Decreases in supply, leftward shifts, increases in supply, rightward shifts. Okay. So I've got kind of the shorthand here, a little bit more words with it, but I like shorthand because it's nice summary, so you can always kind of go back to it. So we've got expectations that matter, just like with consumption or demand. We also have substitutes and complements in production. So we'll talk about substitutes first. I'll try to give you some intuition behind this and think about why this is the case. So let's say I can produce two goods, right? X and Y. I'll use the example. So we might, generally how we think about this is like, if I have a huge production facility, I can produce a bunch of different products. I can produce X or I can produce Y. But I've only got so much time, workers. I have to devote that to producing one of these two goods. So my father-in-law works at GM, and like they have these like huge, I think they're called CNC machines that like create the door and different panels. Well, they can only program it each day. They're like they focus on one make and model of car. Right, so I can set it up so that it's producing, Chevy truck doors one day, or it can be producing, Chevy Camaro doors. Right, these different products. Right? So all of a sudden, the price of one of those goes up. So the price of trucks all of a sudden dramatically increases. If I'm a producer, do I want to supply more trucks or SUVs? Price of trucks goes up. Trucks. So what? If I'm producing more trucks, using my machine to do that, what am I not producing? So what's going to happen to the supply of SUVs? It's going to go down. I'll give you kind of another example, right? Thinking about the flip side of this relationship, because I drive around and see this every day. It's a very Indiana example. If I have an open field and I can plant corn or soybeans this year, right? If the price of soybeans all of a sudden I think is going to be a lot lower, right? When I'm planting in my field this year, do I want to produce or plant soybeans or corn? I'm more likely to want to produce, if soybeans are cheaper and I'm selling them, do I want to produce soybeans or corn? Price of soybeans is lower. Do I want to produce soybeans? Am I more likely to want to produce those or corn? Corn, right? So the price is low. I don't want to sell at a low price. So when the price of soybeans, my Y good, goes down, what am I more likely to do as the farmer? I'm more likely to plant corn, or the supply of this other substitute production is going to increase. I'm always going to want to be producing what has a relatively higher price. So whatever experiences a price decrease, I don't want to supply that. I want to supply more of the other good. Okay? So this is the idea of substitutes in production. I can only produce one of these. Right? And in practice, maybe I have a bunch of fields I can produce some corn, some soybeans. So it won't be this or that. It'll be like a mix. But I know that I will move more towards whatever has a relatively higher price now and move away from whatever has a relatively lower price. Okay. Is that any questions? I do corn and soybeans here. Any questions on that before we keep moving? Okay. Once again, supply increases and decreases. We draw them the same way as shifts of right and leftward shifts. So here I've got complements in production. So this is going to be kind of a weird one. I'll use an example, then I'll come to this one. But I think the example I used to use a lot was if I'm producing like 2x4s or lumber, inherently, if I'm taking these huge trees, producing these 2x4s, what am I going to be getting as a result? Very fine. Maybe you don't have a lot of experience. You run this through a planer, you get a bunch of sawdust, right? You actually can go to like Tractor Supply and buy bags of sawdust. Actually, I think they come in like bucket things, but whatever, right? So in producing 2x4s, I inherently get this other product as well. The other example I sometimes think of, once again, Indiana, if you had like a bunch of goats, right, or sheep, right, inherently by having more sheep, you're also going to get more manure or fertilizer. You're kind of getting two products there. So if I'm like a meat farm, maybe I do like a cattle farm, right? I'm selling beef. I'm also getting a product of manure, right? I'm getting these complements in production. So if the price all of a sudden of sawdust skyrocketed, am I going to want to be more or less likely to produce more of this lumber? Well, remember, how am I getting the sawdust? By producing the lumber. So if the price of sawdust is higher, what happens to the supply of lumber? It's going to increase as well. I'll use another example because I was in Indianapolis, and once you're 21, you should go check this place out. It's called Hotel Tango. So I think you can go there if you're not 21. They have other stuff, but like it's a distillery. So they make like mostly whiskey, but they make other things. So I didn't know this. I did like I've been on too many brewery and distillery tours, but they specifically made me aware of this. When you create whiskey and these other liquors, part of the production process inherently produces this like insanely pure level of like 99.9%. Some of it's alcohol. I think it's pure alcohol that you can't use. You can't ingest it, right? It's basically hand sanitizer, right? It's this high level of alcohol that they can't use to sell as liquor. They're complements in production. So over COVID, when they were producing all this whiskey, they used to have this product that they could have used to produce hand sanitizer, but the price of hand sanitizer was relatively low. So what happened during COVID? The price of hand sanitizer likely skyrocketed. So what happened to their supply of whiskey or liquor? It increased, right? Because by increasing that supply, they got more of this other good, which they could now sell for a higher price. Now, once the price of hand sanitizer has gone back down, what happens to their supply of liquor? It's probably also went back down to what it was before, right? So we don't have as many examples of this, but they do exist, right? So we're kind of going to mention them here, these complements in production. Yeah. This is just the price the good can be sold for in the market. No, these are different goods. It's the price of a different good, right? So X and Y, right? So if the price of hand sanitizer goes up, right? Yes, that's going to influence the quantity supplied of hand sanitizer. That's not what we're talking about. Right? I'm talking about when the price of this other good goes up, what happens to this other product. Correct, which would ultimately, we'll start talking about equilibrium prices. There is going to be this kind of like snowball effect, but for now, we're just talking about what's that first initial direct impact of that price increase in hand sanitizer. Now, remember here, we're also assuming we have perfectly competitive markets. So no one firm's production can influence the market. So like the price of the good won't be changed by my individual firm's production decision because we're looking at perfectly competitive markets here. This is like a monopoly market, all bets are off. Any other questions on this before we finish? Okay. All right. So the last thing that we'll talk about, let me see here. I'll give you some examples in a second. Here's kind of my summary. Don't worry about subsidies on producers. You could scratch that one off. In fact, I'll probably re-upload the slides and take that off just for the sake of right now. But we will talk about taxes. So you can scratch off the subsidy part on production, but we will talk about what happens if we tax producers. And that's because we've really already talked about it. So if I tax producers, what have I increased that we've already talked about? The input prices. So if I tax them, I'm increasing my input price. What's going to happen to supply? Decrease. So we've really already talked about taxes. It's just a different type of input price. Okay. So here's kind of a summary slide of all those things that shift supply. The next thing that we're going to talk about is how do we analyze what the price is of a specific good in the market, and how is that going to be impacted by these shifts in supply and demand. Okay. So initially, we're going to start out, and we're going to talk about this thing called the equilibrium. Okay. So we know that as the price goes up, people want to buy less, but as the price goes up, our producers want to supply more. Those two things are at odds. So where does the market arrive at? Where does it stop? Right. So kind of the easiest non-technical way, and we'll work through this a little bit, is where my supply and demand curve intersect. And I'll kind of give some intuition behind why here in a second. But ultimately, the way we identify our equilibrium point is going to be where our supply and our demand curve intersect. Now, we'll talk about what that represents here in a second, but I think we have the visuals. This will make sense. Basically, my equilibrium price and quantity is going to be once I graph out the supply curve, once I graph out my demand curve, what quantity would I be on my supply and demand curve? And what price would that be? That's the equilibrium price and the equilibrium quantity. If I was over here, well, now when I'm on my supply curve that's below my demand curve, we're not in equilibrium, right? I'm not on the same point of my supply and demand curve. The equilibrium price and quantity will be the equilibrium quantity, it'll be the quantity at which I'm at the same point on my supply and demand curve. Now, these curves, remember, came from market supply and market demand schedules. So if I was looking here, if I didn't have the visual, where would my equilibrium price and quantity be? Well, where does the quantity supplied, the point that I'm at on my supply curve, where does that equal my quantity demanded, the point that I'm at on my demand curve? Well, if I go down here, it looks like they're both 15 at a price of 3. So my equilibrium price would be $3. Oops. And that would result in both my quantity supplied and quantity demanded being the exact same value. So that's how you would identify where this equilibrium price and quantity is. I'll give a little more intuition as behind why that is going to occur. Okay. So if I've got my supply and demand curves, okay, and in fact, well, I won't jump the gun here. What did we say demand reflects? The marginal benefit to who? Consumers. What does the supply curve reflect? To producers. Okay. Now, we'll think about when do people choose to do things, right? As long as the marginal benefit is greater than or equal to the marginal cost. Okay. So for my consumers, What is the marginal benefit? Well, that's represented by my demand curve. So as long as that's greater than or equal to, what's the marginal cost when you buy something? The price, right? The price is a bad thing to consumers, right? It's their cost. What is the marginal benefit to producers? Well, when I sell something, the marginal benefit is the price, right? Exact opposite is what it is for consumers. That must be greater than or equal to what represents marginal cost to the producers, my supply curve. So these things must be true in order for both the producer and consumer to want to produce or consume this specific quantity. So if I think about in this example, let's say the price was right here. At this quantity, if I'm so this is like my hypothetical price, right? Is that price above my marginal cost as the producer? Yes. So will I supply that to the market? Well, the benefits to me are greater than the cost, so yes. At that price, is that less than the marginal benefit to consumers? Yes. So at this quantity, there is a range of prices where we're both going to be okay with, right? We're both going to be better off. So do we see this unit produced and consumed? Yeah. Now, where exactly this would fall, who knows? That we would dive into like bargaining issues, things like that. But it doesn't stop there because we know that we can consume and produce more at the second unit because there's also a range of prices where we would both agree to kind of consume and produce this good. That occurs all the way until we get to this point here. Now, the price is equal to supply, is equal to demand. We're both indifferent about producing and consuming at this point. This would be where we stop. If we kind of continued past this point, now notice these hypothetical prices. Well, now the price is below the marginal cost of producers. They don't want to produce that. The price is above the marginal benefit to consumers. They don't want to consume it, which is why the market, and I kind of use stars a lot of time to represent the equilibrium. That's why my equilibrium quantity would be right where that supply and demand curve intersect. Okay? And the price that would result in that would be the price where the last consumer would be willing to buy this unit and the last producer will be willing to supply it. Okay? So just a little more intuition behind why that is the equilibrium. I'll kind of do a more like hand wave reason. When we were talking about individuals, we said individuals will choose to do something as long as what? The marginal benefit is greater than or equal to the marginal cost. Well, who makes up markets? Individuals, right? So in all this individual decision making, what ends up being the equilibrium point of our market is, well, what quantity does the market stop at? Where the marginal benefits are equal to the marginal costs, right? So it's really the same things keep popping up over and over in a lot of what we do, right? So the individual makes the decisions up to the point where marginal benefits are equal to marginal costs. Markets, we will see the output or the quantity will go all the way up to the point until the marginal benefits to the consumers in that market are equal to the marginal cost of the producers. Any other questions here before we keep moving? Okay. All right. So I'm going to go back to the slides here. Where are we at in time? So we got 30 minutes. I'm going to come back to this at the end of class and work through this. I want to kind of look at how do we take these shifts and understand how is it going to impact these equilibrium points. Okay. So I've got some general things. I'll mention these as we go, but we're always going to figure out what is shifting, which direction is it shifting, and then how is that going to change where our equilibrium point is. So for example, I've got these like empty slides. I'll draw this out for you. There's some summaries in the slides, but I think seeing this worked out might be helpful. So let's do demand shifts first. Okay. So let's say I've got my original demand curve and my original supply curve. I can identify the equilibrium price and quantity as simply where that supply and demand curve intersect. Okay, we just talked about this. If I have a demand increase, right? So let's say this is something like for a normal good. Actually, this is the one I'll do. I said I wanted to talk about subsidies earlier. If I give people money for buying something, that's a subsidy, right? So you'll think about like these electric vehicles. A lot of times it's like through tax write-offs. But a lot of times you're given money if you buy these like environmentally friendly goods, right? Or a lot of you actually have subsidies through what? Loans, I think the Pell Grants, right? Things like that. Those are like you consuming education, you're getting this subsidy from the government. So anytime you're given money for doing something, what's going to happen? Essentially, your marginal benefit would be whatever it is before, plus some additional amount. So what's going to happen to my demand curve? If I'm getting the same amount I was before, plus some additional amount, my demand curve is going to increase, right? Think about it this way. If I'm given money for buying something, am I going to want to buy more or less of it? Jesus, how do you guys go through day to day, right? If someone's giving you money to do something, you should do more of it, right? I mean, this is not, I'm not trying to trick you or anything, right? So we've got these demand increases, right? What's going to happen to my equilibrium point? Well, where does my new demand curve hit my supply curve? Looks like it's up here at a higher price and a higher quantity. So demand increases will increase both my price and my quantity of that good. Okay. Any questions on this idea? Okay. I'll do one that I think is kind of fun off the top of my head for this next one. Well, I want to demand, okay. So let's say that people think the price of something is going to fall a lot, right? So they expect prices in the future are going to decrease. Okay? So maybe this is like people trying to speculate about the stock market. If everybody thinks the price is going to be lower tomorrow, what happens to the consumers? Are they going to want to buy more or less today? Less. So what's going to happen to demand? It's going to decrease. So notice what's happening to my equilibrium currently. If a lot of people think that prices are going to be lower tomorrow, as a result, what happens to demand? It decreases. What does that do to my equilibrium price? Pushes my price and quantity down. So it's kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy. If everybody thinks prices are going to be lower, we all decrease our demand, and that actually pushes the price of that product to be lower. So you notice here, demand is a little bit easier because whichever direction demand goes, if it increases price and quantity. If demand decreases, it'll decrease both the equilibrium price. So it depends. I specifically said if buyers, consumers if we had both producers and sellers expect prices to be different, well, then we'll have simultaneous shifts. We haven't quite gotten it. But in the context of like a stock market example, I use the consumers a lot because, well, there's people whose jobs are to understand the stock market. There's people who think that they can read an article and understand what's going to happen, right? So the expectations of consumers can often be very different than kind of the supplier, right? But yes, we could have simultaneous shifts, which we'll look at later. Yep. Any other questions before we keep moving here? So these would be demand shifts, right? We can also have things that increase or decrease supply, right? So let's say I had my current equilibrium, right? Starting here, okay? If I tax something, so I put a tax on the producers. So let's say, you know, I'm producing something overseas and I want to sell it in the US. What's a tax that's being talked about a lot right now? Tariffs. It's essentially a tax. What did I do to the input prices? I increased them. What happened to supply? Supply is going to decrease, right? So if I increase taxes, we know that that's going to decrease my supply curve. What does that do to my equilibrium price? And what does that do to my equilibrium quantity? Well, what did it do to prices? Drove them up, drove my equilibrium quantity down. So what are tariffs going to do? Increase prices. Basic economics. Right? Any questions on that idea? Thinking about tariffs is essentially taxes, right, on other countries. What if instead I had the price of, what do I want to do here? Let's say I had the price of a substitute in production decrease, right? So this is the idea, if I'm producing two goods, one of them, all of a sudden the price plummets, what's going to happen to the supply of the other good? So the price of the substitute goes down. What's going to happen to the supply of the other good? Am I going to be more or less likely to produce this good? Less likely. So that means I'm going to be more likely to produce whatever its substitute was, right? So here I'm going to have a supply, right, where shift increase. What's that going to do to my equilibrium price and quantity? It's going to push my price down, but my quantity up. So supply shifts don't push both price and quantity in the same direction. They actually push them in opposite directions. Okay. So once again, supply is always a little bit more of a headache. Right? It doesn't a little bit less intuitive sometimes. Yeah. So I put all of these on the same graph, right? I've got summaries where I put them each on individual graphs. Kind of stole these from a textbook, right? And kind of some words associated with these depictions, right? But you can kind of have them all summarized in the slides here as well. Okay. Any questions on that before we keep moving here? So, got two more things I want to do, and I'll probably go through maybe the questions for the quiz pretty quick at the end. So I'm just going to get it so that it shows up right now, so that Wi-Fi issues, anything aren't an issue. We'll kind of go through them towards the end of class. But for now, we have a couple more things that I want to get through before we get to those. Okay. So those should show up on Canvas. If they're not in the next couple minutes, someone raise their hand and be like, you didn't hit the button right, but I think I just published it. Okay. So I just went through like individual shifts and how that impacts equilibrium. But in the real world, multiple things can happen at the same time, right? So a lot of times we'll have things that both shift supply and demand, and then the answer isn't quite as clear. So I'm going to go through one combination and then show you the slides where I've got the other combinations. You've got practice problems that you should kind of have some other examples, but you could work through any different combination of supply increase or decrease and demand increase or decrease. So I chose this example where I had asphalt, right? So I had two things happening. So I had a huge increase in the price of oil, which is a major input in producing, let's think about these as like asphalt driveways, right? So if I need oil to produce asphalt, and its prices went up, what happens to the supply of asphalt driveways? Decreases. Now, here, I think this maybe wasn't in the slides. I added it in and made sure yesterday I went to the quiz to make sure I'm always adding in this terminology. What if at the same time we had an increase in the price of gravel, which is a known substitute in consumption, right? I could put in a gravel or an asphalt driveway. If gravel all of a sudden is more expensive, am I more or less likely to want to buy or consume an asphalt driveway? More likely. All right, so we've got this increase in demand and a decrease in supply. Right? So here I've got simultaneous shifts. What's that going to look like? Okay, so here's how I would work through this. Right, I would not put these on the same graph. Okay, I would draw out two separate graphs that start out in equilibrium. Right. So the steps would be, I first already identified what the changes that were occurring were, right? It was now I forgot, but I think it was an increase in demand and a decrease in supply, okay? I'm then going to draw out each one of those individually to determine how would they both impact the equilibrium, and then I'm going to look at the total effect. So here, if I had a supply decrease, what is that going to look like? A left or rightward shift. Decreases are left shifts. So what's going to happen to my equilibrium point? My quantity is going to go. Oh, thank you. Sorry. Should have told me that ahead of time. There we go. This might make a little more sense. So I just drew out kind of both, like in the market that's in equilibrium, right? So here I've got my supply decrease. What did that do to my equilibrium? This supply decrease drove my price up, but it pushed my equilibrium quantity down. Okay. At the same time, we had a demand increase. So that's going to be a rightward shift. And if it helps, like really draw these very pronounced, right? So where's my new equilibrium price and quantity? Well, this demand increase drove my equilibrium price up, but it also drove my equilibrium quantity up. Okay. So after I draw out both of these, what I would then do is, okay, here's the impacts of both of these shifts. What is the total effect? Well, when they happen at the same time, if they're both pushing the price up, what's going to happen to my price? If both of them are increasing the price, I know price is going to have to increase, right? However, they're pushing the quantity in opposite directions. So what's going to happen to my equilibrium quantity? So someone says it stays the same. It would only stay the same if these shifts were exactly the same amount. So in order to know which of these effects wins out or which of these is larger, I'd have to know something about the size of the effects. I'm not going to push you that far. This will be the first example of many in this class where sometimes we have an answer where the answer is indeterminate. We don't know. We need more information about the size of these shifts. So anytime you have these simultaneous shifts, if they're pushing something, in this example, they're pushing quantity in the opposite direction, we don't know what's going to happen to the equilibrium quantity. The change is indeterminate. The same thing can happen to price. You can't have indeterminate changes in price. It would just be from a different combination of supply and demand shifts. Okay. So this is just one of the combinations, right? There's 4 different possibilities. Supply decrease, demand decrease, supply decrease, demand increase, supply and demand increase, supply increase, demand decrease, right? You have 4 different combinations. So maybe a good thing to do is try to draw out each combination and do something similar to this, right? We've got enough time to work through one of them, not all 4, okay? However, I kind of gave you the summaries once again. So this is kind of what we did just without arrows. I think drawing it with arrows and doing the shorthand like that always makes more sense. But you can use words as well. I've got the other kind of combinations. Once again, these 4 different combinations. If you want to kind of work through them and kind of make sure you know what's happening, might be some good review before you take the quiz or as we get closer to the exam. Here's kind of the shorthand of all these different possible combinations. So here's just supply and demand increases on their own. Here's the combination of if I have a supply and demand increase, what happens to price and quantity? Demand decrease, supply increase, what happens to equilibrium quantity supply? and these kind of mean indeterminate, right? We don't know. Okay. All right. Any other questions before we keep moving here? Okay. All right. So I've got one more thing that I'll expect of you on the quiz that I want to go through. And if we have time, I'll kind of go through that in-class quiz questions pretty quickly, but probably be pretty friendly in giving you the answers, right? So I'm going to go all the way back to this slide somewhere right here, right? Slide 40. So I might do something like this, where I give you the supply and demand equations, and I ask you to identify what the equilibrium price and quantity are. Okay. So how can we do that? All right. So I've got my demand equation, my supply equation. I was given to be this. What was it? 20 plus 15. Now, and sorry, this was price equal to this guy. Right? So if I give you a supply and demand equation, when you're looking for the equilibrium, what are you really looking for? Right? You're looking for the price and quantity where the quantity supplied is equal to the quantity demanded. So when I have my equations for demand and supply, really this is the quantity demanded and the quantity supplied. But I know the equilibrium point will be the price at which those two things are equal to each other. So if I have two equations, what could I do? Simply set them equal to each other. Now it's just a little bit of algebra, right? So the first step would be set my two equations equal to each other. Do a little bit of algebra here and get what? So add 5q to both sides. 80 is equal to 20q. Divide both sides by 20. And I get my equilibrium quantity is 4. All right. So set my two equations equal to each other and then solve for what's the quantity where I would have the exact same quantity supplied as quantity demand. Right. That quantity in this case is going to be 4. Okay. How would I then find my equilibrium price? What could I do if I now know the quantity? I could go back and plug it into my supply curve, or I could plug it into my demand curve. If I've done it correctly, they should give me the same value, right? So if I plug 4 into here, I'm going to get what? 100 minus 5 times 4 is 80. And then 20 plus 14 times 4, sure enough, would also give me this equilibrium price of 80, right? So if I ever give you equations and ask you to solve for the equilibrium price and quantity, set the equations equal to each other, do a little bit of math, solve for that equilibrium quantity, and then to get the equilibrium price, plug it into either one. Now, if it were me and I had time, I'd plug it into both, because if I plug it into both, I should get the same answer. If I don't, I might have made a mistake with my algebra, right? So that's a good way to kind of check yourself, okay? So with this in mind, I think I also asked what the marginal benefit of the 5th unit would be here. So if I'm looking at this, what represents marginal benefits? The demand equation. So when I have a demand equation, that price really is telling me my marginal benefit. Now, what's the marginal benefit of the 4th unit? Where am I at in my demand curve? At a price of 80. So what has to be true about the marginal benefit of the 5th unit? It's going to be a little bit lower. How would I find the marginal benefit? I simply plug whatever quantity I want to find the marginal benefit of into my demand equation. What would that give me? 75. Sure enough, at that quantity of 5, my marginal benefit, or the price reflects that marginal benefit, is a little bit lower than that equilibrium of 75. Okay. Now, what if I wanted the marginal cost of the third unit? Well, what represents marginal costs? Supply. So at that third unit, what should be true about the marginal cost? Well, the marginal cost of my fourth unit is 80. Remember, that equilibrium point is the point where the marginal benefit to the consumer is the exact same as the marginal cost of the producer. So at a quantity that's a little bit lower than that, my marginal cost must be a little bit lower than 80. Sure enough, if I plug that quantity of 3 into my supply equation, where that price is really reflecting to me that producer's marginal costs, I get what? 45. That marginal cost is 65. Sure enough, it's a little bit lower than 80. Okay. So I can find marginal benefits, marginal costs using these equations. I can also solve for my equilibrium.
Like when you ask us marginal benefit, are we like automatically assuming that you mean marginal benefit?
Yeah, because I don't have anything from the supply curve that's telling me the marginal benefit. What's the marginal benefit to the consumer? The equilibrium price, right? But the supply curve doesn't reflect that, right? The ultimate marginal benefit is going to be whatever that price, that equilibrium price is. That's kind of the combination of supply and demand. So that's not really a fair game question for me to ask. Yep. Any other questions on this before we end things here a little bit? So hopefully you've got that Canvas quiz pulled open. Kind of go through it quick. I'll give you the answers here, but I'll kind of ask you, so making sure we get it. So let's say I have a government tax. What did we say that does? A tax on producers of a good increases their input prices. Input prices are higher, supply is going to decrease, which is a left or rightward shift. So that would be a leftward shift here. All right, so we got D there. If I have instead substitutes in production, I can make gas-powered vehicles or electric-powered vehicles. If gas vehicles, all of a sudden, the price is falling for some reason, people don't like them as much. As a producer, what's going to happen to my supply for electric vehicles? If I can produce either one of these and gas vehicles are now cheaper, is that a good or a bad thing for producers? Bad. So I don't want to produce gas-powered vehicles. I want to produce electric-powered vehicles. So my supply would, if I want to produce electric vehicles, then in the market for electric vehicles, my supply is going to increase, which is a right or leftward shift. Rightward shift. So here we've got an increase in supply. Okay. The final one we had, just to give another example, I said I'm only going to give you examples where there's taxes on producers, or examples where I'll give you subsidies to consumers, right? So if I give subsidies, I'm giving money to someone for buying something. What's that going to do? So here I think it was electric vehicles. Do you get these like tax write-offs? What's that going to do to demand for electric vehicles? Increase, which would be a rightward shift in demand. Right? So make sure kind of getting those answered. We just went through all of them together. If you're paying attention, should be easily to get all the points. Submit it by, I think I have it set to be 11:50. So just get those entered in, submit it before you leave. Other than that, CL sessions tonight and Sunday. If you have any questions, call after class. Have a fun, safe weekend, and I will see you guys on Tuesday.